Liverpool calls itself a city reborn. For the men in this list, it was a hunting ground, a city where the docks fed a cocaine empire worth £300 million, 150 guns planted to buy a royal pardon, and a 9-year-old girl shot dead on her own doorstep. These are the stories of Liverpool's most notorious gangsters. Section 1. Tommy Comerford and the birth of the Liverpool Mafia. Water Street runs through the heart of Liverpool city centre, connecting the business district to the waterfront. In the summer of 1969, on one of the bank holiday weekends of August, a gang of men from North Liverpool spent 3 days tunnelling into the basement of a branch of the district bank on that street. They brought with them a thermal lance, a tool designed to cut through metal using a jet of burning oxygen, and they used it to open the safe. By the time they were finished, they had removed over £140,000 in cash and a further £20,000 in property. At the prices of the time, it was one of the largest bank robberies the city had ever seen. The men slipped out the way they came. No one was watching. No alarm had triggered, and for a short while, it seemed they might simply vanish. They did not vanish. The man who organised that job was Tommy Comerford, a Vauxhall-born criminal who had been stealing since adolescence, and whose arrest for that robbery would eventually send him to prison for 10 years. But the 10 years mattered less than what came after them. What came after changed the economics of crime in Liverpool, and then in Britain permanently. Comerford came out of prison and decided he was done with banks. The era of armed robbery, he understood, was running its course. The risks were growing, the sentences getting longer, and the men willing to stand in front of a counter with a firearm were getting harder to manage. There was another trade, one that was becoming visible on the streets of Vauxhall and Toxteth and Kirkdale, one that required patience and geography rather than brute force. He moved into drugs, and when he did, he brought the same planning to it that he had brought to the bank on Water Street. Only now, the safe he was trying to open was an entire continent's supply chain. Comerford grew up in Vauxhall, a district of tight terraces and working-class families that sat just to the north of the city centre, close enough to the docks to know how they operated. His father's generation had worked those docks. His older brothers and cousins had watched the cargo come in and go out. The port of Liverpool was, for most of the 20th century, one of the busiest in the world, handling goods from the Americas, West Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and the Mediterranean. It was also, by necessity, an ecosystem of casual labour, shifting paperwork, and relationships built on trust between men who worked irregular hours in an environment that was difficult to police at any scale. Theft from the docks was so routine that it was almost an industry of its own. The dockers who found ways to redirect goods understood the rhythms of the place, which manifests got checked, which warehouses were watched, which hours the supervisors spent elsewhere. Comerford understood that too, and when he needed to move product rather than steal it, the docks were where he turned. By the time he was released from prison in the mid-1970s, a shift was happening in the city's criminal economy that few people had fully recognised yet. Heroin had begun to appear on the streets of North and South Liverpool, and cannabis had been moving through the port for years. The men who controlled the supply of those drugs were not the organised syndicates of later years. They were individual dealers, importers with single connections, people who stumbled into a supply and built something modest around it before finding themselves exposed. There was no structure, there was no cartel. Comerford looked at what was in front of him and saw an opportunity that no one had properly seized. He built what became known, eventually, as the Liverpool Mafia. The name was partly a press invention, but it captured something real. This was the first organised drug trafficking network in Britain. Not a loose arrangement of dealers who knew each other. A network with defined roles, supply relationships, distribution channels, and a leadership structure at the top of which sat Comerford himself. He used the contacts he had on the docks to bring in cannabis from North Africa, Morocco principally, taking advantage of the freight routes that came through Liverpool on a regular basis. The operation required corrupt dock workers to intercept and divert consignments, and Comerford had spent enough time in Vauxhall to know which men were open to that kind of approach. He understood the logic of what he was building. If the product moved inside legitimate freight, it was almost invisible. The challenge was not importation. The challenge was controlling enough of the chain to keep it invisible for long enough to matter. The early cannabis operation had its failures. Sources record an early attempt involving 4 men recruited by Comerford to collect a consignment from North Africa. which resulted in all four being arrested by Merseyside police and customs upon their return. It was the kind of setback that might have persuaded a cautious man to stop. Comerford was not a cautious man. He absorbed the loss, reduced the exposure of the operation's higher levels, and kept going. The logic of what he was doing was sound. The Liverpool docks could move anything. They moved container loads of cars and canned goods and industrial machinery without the authorities being able to check every item in every consignment. A drugs network embedded in legitimate freight was harder to see than one that operated in the open. Distance from the product was protection. The men at the top of the hierarchy never touched the cargo. Their job was to organize, communicate, and receive money. Comerford operated on this principle from the start. Through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, he moved the operation from cannabis toward heroin. The economics of that transition were straightforward. Heroin was more concentrated, more valuable per kilogram, and the demand for it in the city was exploding in ways that were visible on every housing estate, from Toxteth to Walton. The press, by the early 1980s, had taken to calling Liverpool Smack City. The name was crude, and it reduced something complicated to a tabloid phrase, but it pointed at a real phenomenon. Heroin had arrived in volume on the streets of the city's most deprived neighborhoods at the same time that the economy was collapsing. The docks were mechanizing. The factories were closing. Unemployment in parts of North Liverpool was running at levels that made the headline national figures look modest. Into that environment came cheap, increasingly available heroin, and behind the heroin came the organizations that supplied it. Comerford was already ahead of where most people were looking. His international connections deepened during this period. One of the more remarkable threads in his criminal biography is the link to United States military personnel stationed in West Germany during the 1980s. Sources indicate that Comerford's network was involved in supplying heroin to American servicemen based in West Germany, a market that was both lucrative and logistically coherent, given the existing freight routes connecting Liverpool to the European continent. This operation was disrupted by law enforcement, and the resulting prosecution brought Comerford a 14-year sentence. He went back to prison. The network he had built did not disappear while he was inside. The men who had worked around him knew enough to keep things moving, and the infrastructure he had created was durable enough to survive the removal of its founder. He was released and continued to operate. In 1996, undercover officers posing as drug buyers managed to get close enough to Comerford's operation to build a case. He was convicted of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and went back to prison for 10 years. It was a pattern that would define his life. He spent more than 34 years in prison in total, the consequences of a criminal career that stretched from the late 1960s to the mid-1990s. He died in October 2003 in Liverpool, aged somewhere between 70 and 71, of cancer. By then, the city's criminal landscape had moved far beyond anything he had created, but it had moved in the direction he had pointed it. The thing about Comerford's legacy is that it was structural rather than personal. He was not, in the way that later figures would be, a man whose individual charisma or violence defined the era. He was an organizer. His contribution to Liverpool's criminal history was to demonstrate that the docks were a gateway for drug importation on a commercial scale, and that a network with defined roles and internal discipline could operate for years while avoiding the attention of law enforcement. Every significant drug trafficking operation that followed him in the city owed something to the model he built, even when the men who ran those operations had never met him or did not know his name. The architecture of corruption, of insiders managing manifests, of products embedded in legitimate freight, of money moving upward through a chain of people who were deliberately kept ignorant of each other, that architecture was his. It is also worth paying attention to what Liverpool was, physically and economically, at the moment Comerford made his transition from armed robbery to drug trafficking. The city's port had made it an international junction point for over 2 centuries. The same geography that allowed cotton and tobacco and sugar to flow through in the 19th century allowed cocaine and heroin to flow through in the 20th. The routes were the same. The relationships between Liverpool and continental Europe, between Liverpool and the Americas, between Liverpool and West Africa, those relationships were embedded in the physical infrastructure of the port. Comerford did not create those routes. He understood that they were already there, waiting to be used in a different direction. There is also something important about timing. The 1981 Toxteth riots, which erupted in the summer of that year and brought the army of photographers and reporters to the city for weeks, were the product of exactly the same pressures that were feeding the drug trade. The poverty, the unemployment, the systemic neglect of the city's inner districts by central government, those were the conditions inside which the trade grew. The riots made the underlying situation visible to the rest of the country. For the men already operating inside the trade, the riot was a backdrop rather than a revelation. They knew what the city looked like behind the camera footage. Comerford himself came from Vauxhall rather than Toxteth. His territory was the north end of the docks rather than the south. But the economics that his operation exploited were city-wide, and the market he helped create was concentrated in exactly the neighbourhoods that the television cameras would later return to, repeatedly, as Liverpool's crime story became a national one. He built the first platform on which others stood, and the men who would follow him, the men who would take Liverpool's name to the Sunday Times Rich List and to Interpol's Most Wanted database and to Colombian cartel boardrooms, those men grew up in a city where the trade was already established, the roots already proven, and the precedent of what was possible already set by a docker's son from Vauxhall who tunnelled into a bank on a bank holiday weekend and then spent the rest of his working life tunnelling into something larger. He served his final sentence and was released. He did not return to work. He was in his early 70s, and the cancer was already progressing when he died. There were no headlines marking his death in the way that there would be for other figures from Liverpool's criminal history. He had operated in an era before cameras and before the kind of national media scrutiny that later drug lords attracted. His name circulated in the city, in the police files, in the accounts written by journalists who had spent time inside Liverpool's criminal world. But he was never the public figure that his successors became. What remained was the model, the docks as gateway, the corrupt insider as essential infrastructure, the hierarchy that kept the people at the top away from the product, the supply line running south to North Africa, and then east and west across Europe. These were not inventions of the men who came after. They were refinements of a method that Tommy Comerford had already proven worked. The city he built that method in was about to produce individuals who would take it to a scale he had never imagined and apply it through connections that reached across the Atlantic and deep into South America. By the time those individuals were operating, Liverpool had earned a reputation in law enforcement circles that it would carry for decades. The reputation was founded on what had already happened in the docks, in the warehouses, in the freight channels that ran through the port on Water Street and far beyond it. Comerford did not choose that future. He made it available. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tommy Comerford turned the Liverpool docks into Britain's first drug pipeline, spending 34 years in prison, across a career that stretched from a bank vault on Water Street to heroin networks reaching West Germany. The model he built did not die with him. Next, we look at the man who inherited it and took it further than Comerford ever reached, deep into Toxteth and out the other side of the 1981 riots. Section 2. Michael Showers and the Toxteth Godfather. Michael Showers was born in Toxteth on the 14th of July 1945 into a family of 11 siblings. He grew up in the L8 district at a time when it was one of the most racially diverse areas in Britain, home to communities with roots in West Africa, the Caribbean, Yemen, and China, alongside white working-class Liverpool families who had lived there for generations. The docks had brought that diversity, as they had brought everything to Liverpool, through the simple logic of the port's global reach. By the time Showers was a teenager, the docks were already beginning their long contraction, and the neighbourhoods that depended on dock labour were beginning to feel what that contraction meant. His first conviction came in 1963, when he was 17. He was sent to Borstal for his part in a stabbing. When he came out, he began robbing banks. Armed robbery was the logic of the era. The men who would later build drug empires across Liverpool came, many of them, through exactly this route. The progression from petty crime to armed robbery to drug trafficking was not random. It reflected the changing economics of crime in a city where the legitimate economy was shrinking. Bank robbery required organisation, nerve, and a willingness to accept a long sentence if it went wrong. The sentences, when they came, provided an education. Prison in the 1960s and 1970s was where the networks were built and the connections made, where men with ambition and no legitimate outlet found each other and began to plan. Showers moved through this world with the attention of a man who was taking notes. By the time the 1981 riots came, Showers had built a reputation in Toxteth that was more complicated than his criminal record suggested. He had positioned himself as a community figure, a man who understood what the district needed and who spoke for it in public. In the immediate aftermath of the riots, he formed what became known as the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee, a community organisation set up to respond to the aftermath of the unrest and to advocate for the people of Toxteth in their dealings with authorities. The organisation was real, the advocacy was real, and at the same time, Showers was operating one of the most significant drug importation networks in the country. He had found a way to exist in both registers simultaneously, the community elder and the trafficking principal, the man who sat in council meetings, and the man who arranged the movement of controlled substances through the port. This dual existence was not unique to him among Liverpool's major criminals of the era. Several of the city's organised crime figures of the 1980s and early 1990s maintained social profiles that sat alongside, and sometimes obscured, their criminal operations. The city's institutions, under pressure from the same economic collapse that was feeding the criminal economy, were sometimes willing to work with figures from the community, regardless of their background. Sources indicate that for a period during the 1980s, despite existing convictions for robbery, shooting, stabbing and drug trafficking, Showers found himself employed by Liverpool City Council as an immigration advisor. The appointment was later scrutinised, but in the moment it reflected how far a man could operate across different worlds in a city that was trying to hold itself together under conditions of severe stress. What Showers was building during this period, behind the community work and the occasional engagement with local government, was a cannabis importation operation that was then without parallel in British criminal history in terms of its scale. He had connections reaching into West Africa, specifically Nigeria, and through those connections he was able to arrange the shipment of cannabis in consignments of up to 1 ton at a time. A single successful shipment of that size, moved to street level through a distribution network, generated profits in the region of £700,000. The model drew on the same logic that Comerford had established: use the port, use insiders, use the freight infrastructure that already existed. Showers had the advantage of genuine international relationships with suppliers in a part of the world that was connected to Liverpool through the old trading routes of the empire and through the diaspora communities that had settled in L8 over generations. Those relationships gave him access that a white criminal from North Liverpool could not easily replicate. His brother Delroy was part of the operation, which gave the network a family structure that made it more resilient to individual arrests. The use of family ties in organised crime serves a specific function that is worth understanding quietly. A family member shares interests with the principal in a way that a hired employee does not. A hired employee, when arrested, faces a calculation about whether cooperation with prosecutors serves their individual interests. A family member's calculation is more complicated. The arrest of one family member puts pressure on others in a way that can either collapse the structure or tighten it, and experienced criminal families learn to build their operations around that reality. The Showers brothers structured their operation with enough separation between them that an arrest of one would not automatically expose the other. Delroy's own criminal career would eventually lead him to Denmark, where he received a 14-year prison sentence. He escaped from a Danish prison in 1994, a fact that gives some measure of how well-travelled the network had become and how far from Liverpool its consequences eventually reached. Delroy's son, Rolando, would later become a figure in the European criminal underworld, with contacts in South America, the Netherlands, Spain and Germany, a generational continuation of a criminal geography that Michael Showers had helped to establish from a house in Toxteth. The operation that finally brought Michael Showers down came through a sting that British law enforcement had taken considerable time to construct. Operation Rain Man was a joint operation between the Metropolitan Police and HM Customs and Excise, and it targeted Showers at the level of a specific conspiracy to import heroin. The detail of the sting was that undercover officers posed as part of a drug supply network, inserting themselves into the chain at a point where Showers believed he was dealing with a trusted contact. The operation took time. These things require patience, the building of a relationship convincing enough to survive the kind of scrutiny that experienced criminals apply to every new contact. Showers was experienced. He had been operating for years and had seen enough to be cautious. The undercover operation was careful enough and went on long enough to produce evidence that was usable in court. In 1991, Showers was convicted of conspiring to import high-grade heroin with a street value of £2 million. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison. He was 45 years old at the time of conviction. He would be 65 before the sentence was served, which it was, with the sentence beginning in Britain before he was transferred at some point to serve part of it outside the country. He protested his innocence throughout and continued to do so after his release. His position, maintained consistently, was that he had been entrapped, that the case against him had been constructed by law enforcement through the use of techniques that amounted to the manufacture rather than the detection of crime. These arguments were not accepted by the courts. He served the sentence. What makes Showers a significant figure in Liverpool's criminal history is not simply the scale of his operation at its peak, though the 1-ton cannabis shipments were remarkable. It is the position he occupied at a specific moment in the city's development, the years between the end of the dock economy and the full emergence of the city as a node in the European cocaine trade. He bridged those years. He operated in the space between the older culture of armed robbery and dock theft and the newer, more internationally connected world of drug trafficking that would produce Curtis Warren and Colin Smith and the networks that followed them. He was aware of both worlds and moved between them. There is also the question of what Toxteth meant as a geography of crime. The L8 district and the streets around Granby Street and Prince's Road and Upper Parliament Street had been a centre of informal economic activity for decades before the riots made them nationally visible. The communities there had developed their own systems for managing resources and relationships outside the formal economy, partly because the formal economy had always been less accessible to them than to other parts of the city. The same networks of trust and community relationship that Showers drew on for his criminal operation were the networks that also sustained the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee, the same social capital repurposed for different ends depending on the moment and the need. Understanding that doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains the context inside which he operated, and why he was able to maintain a public face that bore so little relation to his actual activity for so long. By the time of his release from the British portion of his sentence, in or around the year 2000, Liverpool's criminal landscape had been transformed. Curtis Warren, who had grown up in some of the same streets, had risen and fallen and was serving his Dutch prison sentence. Colin Smith was still operating his cocaine empire. The Hoyton firm was beginning to consolidate. The county lines model, which would later extend Liverpool's criminal reach to every corner of England and Wales, was still years away, but the infrastructure of the trade, the routes, the contacts, the precedents for how to move product and money was already mature. Showers had contributed to that maturity and had been, for a time, one of the people who defined it. In 2010, he was arrested again. Turkish police, working alongside the British Serious Organised Crime Agency in a joint operation, detained him in Turkey on suspicion of involvement in heroin smuggling. He was in his mid-60s. He was sent to Maltepe prison in Turkey, where he served a further sentence before being released in 2016. He was over 70 years old by the time he walked out of a Turkish prison. He maintained throughout that he had been wrongly accused, that his presence in Turkey was not connected to any drug operation, that the authorities had, again, constructed a case around a man they wanted to prosecute rather than a man who had committed the crime they alleged. The Turkish authorities and the British agencies that assisted them disagreed. His story covers more than 5 decades of criminal activity across multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple eras of the drug trade. He began in an era when a ton of Nigerian cannabis moved through the Liverpool docks was considered an extraordinary operation. He was still being investigated and prosecuted when that world had been replaced by encrypted messaging platforms, drone surveillance, financial intelligence analysis, and the kind of multinational law enforcement cooperation that the drug trade itself had effectively necessitated. The methods changed entirely around him. He adapted, or attempted to. The sentence imposed by a Turkish court on a man in his late 60s is the last chapter in public record. What persists is the geography. Granby Street is still there, a few of the Victorian terraces now repainted in the bright colours of the Granby Four Streets project, a neighbourhood art initiative that turned derelict houses into something the city tours visitors through. The docks are a waterfront development now, restaurants and hotels, and a museum. The container terminal moved to the north end of the Mersey. The physical infrastructure through which Showers and his contemporaries moved their product has been transformed into something unrecognisable by comparison with the working port of the 1970s and 1980s. The criminal networks that grew around that infrastructure have adapted in turn, but the starting point, the insight that the port was a gateway and that criminal organisations with the right connections could use it as one, that insight belongs to the generation that Showers represented, and it did not disappear when the port changed shape. He was the godfather, as sources describe him, of a specific era and a specific geography. Not the last word, not the largest operation, but the man who looked at Toxteth from inside it and understood, before almost anyone else in the city, that the global connections available through a British port city could be turned to different uses than the ones the port authorities had in mind. That understanding was the most significant thing he passed on, even if the men who would take it furthest never worked directly with him and may never have thought of his name. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Michael Showers moved cannabis in ton-weight shipments from Toxteth for decades, surviving prosecutions across 2 continents before a Turkish prison became his final chapter. The streets that shaped him would soon produce a man who appeared on the Sunday Times Rich List and became Interpol's most wanted criminal on Earth. Section 3. Curtis Warren and the making of Interpol's Target 1. Curtis Francis Warren was born on the 31st of May, 1963, the second son of a South American-born seaman who served in the Norwegian Merchant Navy, and a woman named Antonia Chantre, the daughter of a shipyard boiler attendant. He grew up in Granby with his brother Ramon and sister Maria, in the same streets where Michael Showers had built his network a generation earlier, in a neighborhood where the gap between what the city offered and what the city promised had never been wider than it was in the decade of Warren's childhood. His first conviction came when he was 12 years old: car theft. By 15, he was being processed for burglary. These were not unusual trajectories in Toxteth in the 1970s, where the collapse of the dock economy was removing the legitimate pathways that an earlier generation had relied on. The Borstal and the youth custody system provided the same education they always have, which is to say, an introduction to older criminals, a compressed version of the connections that would take longer to build on the outside, and a sharpening awareness of what was available if you were willing to reach for it. Warren came out of those early encounters harder and more focused than he went in. He began working as a bouncer at nightclubs in the city. That decision, which might have looked like settling into ordinary work, turned out to be the most significant career move he ever made. The nightclub door in Liverpool in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not simply an entrance to a venue. It was a point of control over who had access to the drug economy that operated inside and outside, and in the car parks and back streets around every significant club in the city. The bouncer who understood this could position himself not just as the person who decided who came in, but as the person who decided which dealers operated on the premises, which suppliers had access to the customer base inside the doors, and which competitors were excluded. That position generated relationships. Those relationships generated knowledge. Warren used both with a methodical thoroughness that later became one of the most remarked upon features of his criminal career. He learned the structure of the trade from the inside of it, from the suppliers who came to him and the dealers who depended on his decisions. He was patient. He took notes, in the most literal sense, keeping quantities and contacts and financial details in a memory that multiple sources later described as photographic. He never wrote anything down. He never called anyone by their real name. By the mid-1980s, he was operating independently as a cannabis importer, using connections to Turkish traffickers to bring cannabis resin into the country and distributing it through networks he had built around the club scene. The Turkish connection was one of the established routes of the era, well understood by law enforcement but difficult to close down because the supply chains were long. The product moved through multiple hands before it arrived in England, and the organizers at the top of the chain were careful to keep their distance from the physical movement of goods. Warren was careful in the same way. He delegated, he compartmentalized. He established the principle, which he would apply throughout his career, that the person who never touched the product could not be connected to it in a way that a court would find straightforward to prosecute. The principle was sound. It kept him free and operating for longer than most people in his position managed. His next move was the one that placed him in a different category from every British criminal of his generation. In the early 1990s, through a process that sources describe as involving repeated and careful approaches over an extended period, Warren established direct contact with the Cali cartel in Colombia. The Cali cartel was, at that point, one of the 2 most powerful cocaine trafficking organizations in the world, a group of businessmen who operated with a sophistication and a financial scale that made the Medellin cartel of Pablo Escobar look, in certain respects, crude by comparison. They were not easy to approach. They did not take meetings with unknown quantities. The fact that Warren managed to establish himself as a direct buyer, rather than working through the layers of European middlemen who absorbed a significant portion of the profit on every transaction, was an achievement that law enforcement agencies across the continent were still trying to fully understand years later. He was the first British criminal to buy directly from the Colombians. The supply chain he was able to access as a result was larger, purer, and more profitable than anything available through existing European intermediaries. The operation grew through the early 1990s with a speed that reflected both the quality of his supply and the sophistication of the distribution network he had assembled. He moved cocaine and cannabis through Europe, in volumes measured in hundreds of kilograms per shipment, using a shifting roster of methods and routes that were designed to make interdiction difficult. He worked with associates in Spain, the Netherlands, Turkey, and Eastern Europe, structuring the network so that no single arrest would collapse the whole. The Swiss bank account details were in his head, not on paper. Conversations about specific transactions happened through a rotating system of code words and intermediaries. He maintained what sources describe as an unlimited credit line with the Cali cartel, meaning he could take product on consignment and pay when it reached the market, a relationship available only to principals who had already proven their reliability at scale. The money this generated was extraordinary. Estimates of his peak fortune, tested later in confiscation proceedings, reached £300 million. In 1996, Warren moved his base of operations to the Netherlands, establishing himself in a villa outside Amsterdam. The decision made sense from a criminal logistics perspective. The Netherlands was the main European transit hub for cocaine coming in from South America, and having the principal of the operation physically present in the hub reduced the number of communications required to manage each transaction. Dutch law enforcement were already aware of him through intelligence sharing with British authorities. What they were building was a surveillance operation of sufficient detail to support a prosecution. They wiretapped his phones, they monitored his movements, they tracked the shipments he was coordinating. On the 24th of October 1996, a specialist Dutch police unit raided his villa and a number of associated properties. What they found inside was a record of the operation's scale: 400 kilograms of cocaine, 1,500 kilograms of cannabis resin, 60 kilograms of heroin, 50 kilograms of ecstasy, 3 guns, ammunition, hand grenades, crates containing 960 CS gas canisters, 400,000 Dutch guilder in cash plus 600,000 United States dollars. The total value of the haul was estimated at £125 million. The Cali cartel had been planning to route the cocaine shipment onward to Bulgaria and then into markets across Eastern Europe. The shipment was not going to make that journey. Warren was convicted in the subsequent Dutch trial and sentenced to 12 years. While serving that sentence at New Vossenveld prison, a fellow prisoner named Cemal Guklu, a Turkish national serving time for an unrelated conviction, launched what was described in court as an unprovoked attack in the prison yard. Warren defended himself. The manner of that defense, specifically a kick to the head delivered with sufficient force to kill Guklu, resulted in a further conviction for manslaughter and an additional 4 years added to his sentence. He served the full term. He also appeared, in 1998, on the Sunday Times Rich List, listed as a property developer with an estimated fortune of £40 million. The listing was removed when his conviction became public. The true figure, as later proceedings would establish, was substantially higher than 40 million. He was released from Dutch custody in 2007 and returned to the United Kingdom. The Serious Organised Crime Agency immediately began surveillance. What they observed was a man who was apparently aware that he was being watched and who was trying to operate around that surveillance. He used public telephone boxes rather than mobile phones. He varied his routes and movements. He was seen travelling around the northwest without any obvious legitimate purpose. Within 5 weeks of his return to England, he was arrested in Jersey. The Channel Islands had become the focus of a new operation. Warren and a group of associates had been planning to import cannabis into Jersey, with the first shipment described in a telephone conversation captured by a listening device installed in a vehicle he was using, as just a little starter. The first shipment was valued at £1 million. Warren was describing it as a minimum. He was 44 years old. He had served a combined total of many years in Dutch custody, and he was already planning the next operation. The Jersey prosecution proceeded through 2008 and 2009. The jury deliberated for around 9 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on the 7th of October 2009. The judge at the Royal Court of St Helier sentenced him to 13 years. He appealed. The Court of Appeal, despite criticism of certain surveillance methods used by Jersey police, allowed the conviction to stand. He went back inside. In November 2013, while still serving the Jersey sentence, he was ordered to pay a confiscation order of £198 million, representing the assessed proceeds of his criminal career. He did not pay. In March 2014, having failed to satisfy the order, he was given an additional 10 years to be served consecutively. In 2020, a prison officer named Stephanie Smithwhite was jailed for 2 years after being found to have entered into an intimate relationship with him while he was in her custody. He was still in prison. She lost her job and her liberty. He was still in prison. He was released in November 2022. He was 59 years old. A serious crime prevention order placed restrictions on his movements and activities that were extensive. He was banned from traveling to Scotland, banned from using WhatsApp, banned from dealing in cryptocurrency, required to notify the National Crime Agency of any bank accounts, credit cards, communication devices, vehicles, business interests and sources of income, and required to notify the agency of travel outside England and Wales. The restrictions were the architecture of surveillance without bars, designed to make the resumption of his former activities as visible as possible to law enforcement. By July 2024, he had been arrested by the National Crime Agency on suspicion of breaching the order. By August 2024, he had pleaded guilty to 6 counts of failing to comply with its provisions. The charges included failing to notify the NCA of an application for a passport, failing to declare details of bank accounts and communication devices, acquiring a business interest without notification, possessing more than £1,000 in cash without disclosure, and travelling outside England and Wales, including to Spain, without notifying the agency. He was 61 years old. He was standing before Liverpool Crown Court, in the city where he had grown up, entering guilty pleas. The court ordered further hearings. He had been placed on Interpol's list as Target 1 during his peak years of operation, the single most wanted criminal in the organization's global intelligence network. The designation reflected not just the scale of his trafficking, but the threat his operational capability represented to European drug markets collectively. He had accumulated a fortune that confiscation proceedings estimated at close to £300 million and could not get near. He had stood in a Dutch prison yard and killed a man with a kick and served the years for it. He had come out of prison in England and been back inside Jersey within 5 weeks. He had served 13 years, been handed a 10-year extension for unpaid debt to the state, and emerged at nearly 60 to find the National Crime Agency waiting on the pavement. The courts eventually asked him to repay £198 million. He had not paid it. He was still, at the time of the most recent proceedings, living in the northeast of England, in Bolden, in South Tyneside, subject to restrictions that required him to notify an agency every time he put more than £1,000 in his pocket. The distance between that and the Cali cartel was a long way. All of it had been walked in the streets around Granby and the nightclubs of Liverpool and the freight routes that ran between South America and Rotterdam and the coast of Jersey, and it had taken roughly 40 years to travel. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Curtis Warren rose from Toxteth to become the wealthiest criminal Britain had ever produced, dealing directly with the Cali cartel and accumulating a fortune the courts valued at close to £300 million. Next, 2 men who tried a very different approach to staying free and very nearly pulled it off at the level of the Home Secretary. Section 4. John Haas, Paul Bennett, and the Royal Pardon Fraud Southwark Crown Court sits on the south bank of the Thames in London, a substantial distance from the streets of Merseyside, where the events it was asked to judge in November 2008 had taken place. On the 19th of that month, 2 men stood in the dock and were sentenced for one of the most audacious conspiracies to pervert the course of justice that any British court had been asked to consider in the modern era. John Haas received 22 years. His nephew, Paul Bennett, received 20 years. The judge made clear that the offences were of exceptional gravity. What the 2 men had done, over a period stretching from the early 1990s through to the mid-1990s, was to construct an elaborate fiction at the expense of the British legal system, deceive a senior judge, deceive senior customs officials, deceive the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, and in doing so, walk out of prison after serving 11 months of an 18-year sentence for heroin smuggling. The method they used was the planting of 150 illegal firearms in caches across the northwest of England and Scotland, which they then anonymously tipped off to police, presenting themselves as informants of extraordinary value and extracting a royal pardon as their reward. It worked. For 12 years, it worked completely. John Haas was born in Liverpool in 1948, or by some accounts in March 1949. The precise date is less important than the trajectory. He grew up in the city's criminal culture during the years when armed robbery was still the dominant form of organized crime, and he moved through that culture with enough competence to become, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, a significant figure in the city's heroin trade. He was associated with Curtis Warren, who by then was beginning to establish the international connections that would make him the wealthiest criminal in Britain. Haas was not Warren's equal in ambition or scale. He was an operator at a level below the very top, a man who moved product and managed relationships and understood how the trade worked from the inside. His nephew Paul Bennett was part of the same world, a career criminal with convictions for bank robbery and drug smuggling who worked alongside his uncle in the heroin operation that would eventually bring them both before a court. The heroin network that Haas and Bennett operated in the early 1990s had a Turkish dimension. Liverpool's connection to Turkish heroin trafficking was well established by this period. The route ran from Afghanistan and Iran through Turkey and then across Europe, entering Britain through various channels. And Liverpool had established itself as a significant point of domestic distribution. Haas and Bennett's operation imported over 200 kilograms of the drug, a quantity that had a measurable effect on the wholesale price of heroin in the northwest, pushing it down from £24,000 per kilogram to around £20,000 as the supply they were introducing competed with existing sources. This detail, recorded in later proceedings, gives some sense of the volume they were handling. When you move enough of a product to shift its market price, you are operating at a level that goes well beyond the individual dealer or the mid-level supplier. The operation attracted the attention of HM Customs and Excise, which mounted a surveillance investigation that eventually caught up with Haas and Bennett in Croydon, South London, where the two men had nearly slipped through the net of a wider arrest operation targeting their associates in and around Liverpool. They were charged with conspiracy to supply heroin. In August 1995, Judge David Lynch at Liverpool Crown Court sentenced both men to 18 years in prison. The sentence was one of the longest available for drug trafficking and reflected the scale of what had been proven. At that point, the story might have ended as a straightforward, if significant, addition to the list of Merseyside drug convictions. Instead, it became something else entirely. Within weeks of arriving in prison, Haas and Bennett began talking to their solicitor, Tony Nelson, about a proposition. The proposition was this. In exchange for cooperation with law enforcement that led to significant seizures, they would expect to see their sentences reduced. This was not, in itself, an unusual arrangement. Informants who provided genuinely valuable intelligence about criminal networks had long been able to use that cooperation to argue for sentence reductions through established legal mechanisms. What made the Haas and Bennett arrangement unusual was the nature of the intelligence they were about to provide. They told customs officials that they had access to information about illegal firearms caches, weapons hidden across the northwest and into Scotland that could be of significant value to law enforcement. The customs officer in charge of the investigation, Paul Cook, entered into discussions with Nelson. Those discussions resulted in an agreement. Haas and Bennett would provide the location of the caches. Any cooperation would be brought to the attention of the trial judge. A reduced sentence or an early release might follow. Between September and November of 1993, police acting on anonymous tip-offs that were tracing back through a chain of handlers to Haas and Bennett found 35 separate arms caches across the northwest of England and Scotland. The haul was extraordinary. 150 illegal firearms in total, including Kalashnikov assault weapons, Armalite rifles, Thompson machine guns, Bren guns, Uzi submachine guns, and over 1,500 rounds of ammunition. At the time, law enforcement believed the arsenal might be connected to the Provisional Irish Republican Army, which was still active and would not formally declare a ceasefire until August 1994. The political context made the seizures appear even more significant. Here were two men, convicted drug traffickers, who had provided intelligence that had led to the recovery of weapons that might, it was believed, have been intended for use in terrorist attacks on the British mainland. Judge Lynch received a private communication from the senior customs officer recommending that the Home Secretary exercise the royal prerogative of mercy on account of the exceptional assistance the two men had provided. The judge forwarded the recommendation. Michael Howard was Home Secretary in July 1996. He reviewed the recommendation, consulted with senior officials, and signed the order. On the 4th of July 1996, John Haas and Paul Bennett walked out of prison. They had served 11 months of 18-year sentences for heroin smuggling. The release provoked immediate unease in certain quarters. The Liverpool MP Peter Kilfoyle raised questions. Journalists began asking how two convicted drug traffickers had managed to secure a royal pardon in under a year. Howard, when pressed, stated that he had acted in good faith based on the recommendations he had received, and that he could neither reveal nor overstate the risks that would flow from revealing the details of the intelligence involved. The wall held. For years, what police had already begun to suspect, and what the subsequent investigation would eventually prove beyond reasonable doubt, was that the arms caches had been planted by Haas and Bennett themselves. The weapons were not, as the authorities had believed, evidence of existing criminal infrastructure waiting to be discovered. They were props. Haas and Bennett had sourced the firearms, arranged for them to be hidden in the locations that were subsequently tipped off to police, and then presented the discoveries as evidence of their extraordinary value as informants. The weapons were real. The threat they supposedly represented was fabricated. The 35 caches across the northwest and Scotland were not evidence of a dangerous arsenal being taken off the streets. They were the components of a scheme to buy freedom. The scale of the deception is worth sitting with for a moment. Organizing the sourcing and placement of 150 firearms across 35 separate locations, while serving time in a prison that was supposed to restrict your communications and movements, required a network of people on the outside who were willing to carry out specific tasks without asking too many questions, or who were trusted enough to be told the full purpose of what they were doing. The logistics were considerable. The risk of exposure through a single participant deciding to talk to law enforcement was real and was managed somehow. Haas ran the operation from inside. His associates on the outside moved the weapons. And the machinery of British justice, from the customs officer to the trial judge to the Home Secretary, was turned into an instrument of the deception without any of those individuals, as far as the evidence later showed, being aware of what they were facilitating. On their release, Haas and Bennett returned to Liverpool. Haas established a security company called Big Brother, which obtained contracts in the city, including, as sources report, the security provision at Stanley Dock, on the edge of the city centre. The choice of business was not accidental. The security industry had been intertwined with Liverpool's criminal economy throughout the 1990s, a relationship that will be examined in a later section of this account, and a man with Haas's background and connections was positioning himself in exactly the right place to exploit that overlap. Bennett returned to criminal activity in other ways. Both men operated with the confidence of people who believed they had permanently resolved their exposure to the British legal system. The investigation that brought them back to court took years. Merseyside Police, and later the Serious Organised Crime Agency, accumulated evidence over an extended period that the arms caches had been planted rather than discovered. The technical and forensic work involved in establishing this was painstaking. The political sensitivity of the case, given that it implied that a Home Secretary had been deceived into signing a royal pardon, gave the investigation an additional layer of complexity. By 2008, the evidence was sufficient. Haas and Bennett were charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The trial at Southwark Crown Court heard the full account of what had been done. The jury returned guilty verdicts. Haas, by then 60 years old, was sentenced to 22 years. Bennett, 54, received 20 years. The sentences were among the longest handed down for perverting the course of justice in recent British legal history, and the judge's remarks made clear that the gravity of the case lay not just in the deception itself, but in its target. This had not been an attempt to mislead a single officer or to fabricate evidence in a minor case. It had been an attempt to deceive the entire apparatus of British justice up to and including a minister of the Crown, and it had succeeded completely for over a decade. Haas went back to prison for the second time on a long sentence. He would not stay quietly. In March 2020, he was on licence from prison when he was recruited as a criminal enforcer in Sheffield, tasked with collecting an outstanding debt. The debtor's failure to pay led Haas, then 74 years old, to set fire to a Range Rover worth £60,000 outside the property. The arson caused £63,000 of damage to the vehicle and nearby property. He was subsequently recalled to serve the remainder of his 22-year sentence, and then, in January 2024, appeared at Sheffield Crown Court to be sentenced for the arson itself. The judge gave him 9 years, noting that he would remain behind bars until 2030. He was 74. The court heard that he had been recruited as a criminal enforcer while out on license, which indicated that his reputation in certain circles had survived multiple lengthy prison terms without apparent diminution. He would remain in HMP Frankland, the maximum security prison in County Durham, with a release date that placed him past his 80th birthday. Paul Bennett was released at some point after serving a portion of his 20-year sentence and faded from the public record in ways that Haase, with his continued inability to remain undetected, did not. The aftershock of the royal pardon affair extended beyond the two men themselves. Michael Howard, who went on to lead the Conservative Party between 2003 and 2005 and received a life peerage, maintained throughout his public life that he had acted in good faith on the recommendations of officials and the judiciary. The customs officer Paul Cook, whose discussions with the solicitor Tony Nelson had set the machinery of the pardon in motion, faced scrutiny over the extent of his role and what he had or had not known. The question of how a Home Secretary had been deceived at the level of a royal pardon and what that implied about the systems designed to prevent exactly that kind of manipulation was never fully answered in a way that satisfied everyone who asked it. What was established, and what remains part of the record, is that the release of Haase and Bennett in 1996 had consequences that extended well beyond their own subsequent criminal careers. The police officer who investigated the Rhys Jones murder a decade later, Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Green, was among those who would point to the arms cache deception as having reinforced Liverpool's gun culture. The weapons that were planted and then recovered were real weapons, sourced from somewhere and returned to the market or dispersed in ways that were not fully tracked. The gesture of their recovery, which had been presented as a victory for law enforcement and a demonstration of exceptional informant value, had in reality been a criminal exercise that left no one safer and allowed 2 serious offenders to walk free. The Liverpool MP Peter Kilfoyle, who had raised questions from the beginning, described the reverberations of the decision as still being felt a decade after the pardon was signed. He was not wrong. The case sits in a specific position in Liverpool's criminal history because it demonstrates how far the manipulation of legal systems could reach when the people doing the manipulating were patient, imaginative, and willing to invest significant resources in a long game. Haase and Bennett did not simply bribe someone. They constructed an entire false intelligence picture, maintained it across multiple interactions with multiple arms of the state, and extracted a consequence that even experienced criminal practitioners regarded as extraordinary. The Home Secretary's signature was the prize, and they obtained it. The fact that they were eventually caught and sentenced does not change what they achieved in the years between 1996 and 2008. They were free. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. John Haase and Paul Bennett walked out of prison after 11 months of an 18-year sentence, their freedom bought with 150 planted guns and a royal pardon signed by a Home Secretary who had no idea what he was endorsing. Section 5. Colin Smith and the Colombian Execution. On the 13th of November 2007, a Tuesday, a man walked out of a gym in Speke and was shot once with a pump-action shotgun. He fell in the car park. His killer walked away quickly, without running, the way a professional leaves a scene. A few hours later, sources report, the hitman was at Liverpool's John Lennon Airport, boarding a flight out of the country. He was £100,000 richer. The man he had left in the car park was Colin Smith, known in Liverpool and in the criminal networks that stretched from Merseyside to Medellin as Smigger. He was the most successful cocaine trafficker Britain had produced after Curtis Warren, and his death was, according to sources, the first murder on British soil that had been directly sanctioned by a Colombian cartel. No one has ever been charged with his murder. No one has ever been convicted. The case remains open. Understanding what Smith had built requires going back to the early 1990s, to the moment when Liverpool's cocaine trade was being transformed by Warren's direct connection to the Cali cartel, and the price and availability of the drug in the city was shifting in ways that created opportunities for men positioned close enough to the supply chain to take advantage of them. Smith was positioned exactly there. He was from Liverpool, embedded in the networks that moved product through the city, and he had the relationships and the operational intelligence to take a significant share of the market that Warren's operation was making available. As Warren's empire grew and then fell with the Dutch arrests in 1996, The supply chains that had been built around it did not disappear. They required new principles. Smith was among those who stepped into the space that Warren's departure created, and he did so with a commercial instinct that sources consistently describe as exceptional. His operation in the 1990s and into the 2000s became what law enforcement and underworld sources alike characterized as a cocaine empire of extraordinary reach. His estimated fortune was placed at £200 million. That figure, which appears consistently across accounts of his career, puts him in the company of Warren as one of the two wealthiest criminals Britain produced during the era of the Colombian cocaine trade. But where Warren's operation was built around the complexity of a man who memorized account numbers and operated through layers of insulation from the product, Smith's model was different in character, if not in structural principle. He was a consolidator as much as an importer, a man who understood that the real money in a drug economy lay not just in moving product, but in controlling the distribution chain at a level where you could set terms, extend credit, and make other organizations dependent on your goodwill for access to what they needed. The way sources describe his commercial model, Smith functioned as something like a wholesaler of extraordinary generosity within the criminal economy. He made high-level distributors of other gangs and families across Merseyside and beyond, offering cocaine to established criminal networks on terms that were described as generous, which in practice meant competitive pricing and reliable supply that other sources could not match. The effect of this approach was to create a web of dependency across the Northwest's criminal economy, organizations that had become accustomed to Smith's terms and his reliability, and who were therefore structurally tied to the continuation of his operation. When he died, an underworld source quoted at the time observed that he had made a lot of crime families and gangs rich by making them high-level distributors on generous terms. The observation captured the commercial logic precisely. He had expanded the market by making participation in it more accessible and more profitable for others, and in doing so, had made himself central to an economy that extended far beyond any single organization. His Colombian connection was the foundation of this. Direct access to South American cocaine, without the European intermediaries who added cost and risk and unreliability to every transaction, was the competitive advantage that allowed him to offer better terms than his rivals. The Cali cartel had been the initial Colombian contact for Warren's operation. By the time Smith was at his peak, the structure of Colombian cocaine exportation had evolved, with different cartel organizations controlling different export corridors and different European relationships. Smith had built connections that gave him access to substantial quantities at a level that was, in the estimation of sources who spoke about his operation after his death, without parallel in Britain outside of Warren's own peak years. What went wrong appears to have involved money. The details of why the Colombian connection turned lethal are not publicly established in court records, because no prosecution was ever brought. But the accounts that circulated in the aftermath of his murder pointed consistently to a dispute over a debt or a missing consignment of a scale that the cartel regarded as requiring a response that went beyond ordinary commercial negotiation. The Colombian organizations that operated at the level Smith had been dealing with did not treat financial disputes as civil matters. They treated them as matters of consequence that required a consequence of equivalent weight. The decision to send someone to Liverpool, to have that person identify the target, establish his routine, and carry out a killing outside a gym in Speke on a Tuesday morning, represented a calculation about what the resolution of the dispute required. It also represented something new in British criminal history. The import of cartel-sanctioned violence into the United Kingdom to resolve a commercial disagreement that had originated in the cocaine trade was a step that previous British drug operations had not generated. Smith was a father of 5. He was known within the criminal community as someone who kept a lower profile than his wealth might have suggested, a man who did not seek the kind of notoriety that brings attention. He had accumulated a fortune of £200 million while remaining, to a remarkable degree, outside the public record that accumulated around figures like Warren and Huss. He did not appear in court records in the way that his contemporaries did. He was not on a Sunday Times rich list. He was not Interpol's Target 1. He had built an empire that was known to law enforcement and to everyone in the criminal economy of Merseyside, and was nonetheless not a public figure in the way that the scale of his operation might have implied. That relative invisibility was itself an achievement, in the same way that operating at scale without accumulating prosecutable evidence is an achievement. He had managed the exposure of his position carefully enough that when he died, the official record of his criminal career was remarkably thin compared to the unofficial one. The gym in Speak was part of a routine. People who live and operate at the level Smith was functioning understood that routine was risk, that predictability was exposure, and that the management of personal security required the same kind of structural thinking that managing a supply chain did. Smith had clearly not been careful enough about one or the other of those things, or someone with very close knowledge of his movements and habits had provided the information that made the execution possible. The hitman knew where he would be and when. The shotgun blast was precise. The departure from the scene was controlled. These are the characteristics of a professional killing that has been planned with adequate intelligence about the target. The provision of that intelligence to the people who arranged the killing required someone who knew enough about Smith's life to be useful. The criminal response in Liverpool was immediate, or at least the anxiety about what might follow was. Sources close to the situation described the hours and days after the killing as charged with the expectation of further violence. An underworld source said at the time that a lot of people would want revenge. There were men in Liverpool who had worked with Smith, who owed their prosperity to the network he had built, who regarded his death as a wrong that required a righting. At the same time, the Colombian cartel that had arranged the killing was not an organization that responded well to retaliation, and the rational calculation for those considering revenge was a complicated one. The turf war that some feared would follow Smith's death did not erupt in the way the most alarmed predictions suggested, though the criminal landscape of Merseyside was undeniably reshaped by his removal from it. His associate, a man identified in sources only by his connection to Smith's operation and his later criminal trajectory, was jailed in 2005 for 8 years for possessing cocaine worth £650,000. The detail is a marker of how closely integrated the people around Smith were in the trade, and how the disruption of a network of this size rippled outward through the criminal economy in ways that were sometimes visible in court records, even when the central figure was not. The point about Smith's wealth deserves examination from a different direction. £200 million accumulated through the cocaine trade is not money that sits in a bank account under the holder's real name. It is money that is moved, converted, layered, invested, distributed and obscured through a series of transactions designed to make its origins invisible and its connection to the person at the center of the operation deniable. Smith, operating without the public criminal record that Warren had accumulated, had presumably managed this process well enough to keep the law enforcement attention focused on the product side of his operation rather than the financial side. The proceeds of crime legislation that was beginning to be applied with increasing sophistication by British law enforcement during the 2000s was, at the time of his death, still developing the tools and the institutional knowledge required to trace and recover assets at the scale he was dealing with. He died before those tools fully matured. His estate, whatever form it took, was not subject to the kind of confiscation proceedings that pursued Warren's fortune for a decade after his conviction. The area around Speak itself carries the trace of his story in the geography. The airport carries the name of the city's most famous cultural export. The gym is ordinary. The car park where he fell is a car park. Cities do not mark the locations of gangland executions with anything except the absence of an explanation, the ordinary quality of a place where something extraordinary happened, and then the everyday world closed back over. Speak is still Speak. The murder is still unsolved. There is a thread that connects Smith's story to a larger question about what the Colombian cartel connection meant for British organised crime. Warren had established it. Smith had deepened it and used it to build an operation of equal scale, if not equal public visibility. The connection between Liverpool and South America, forged through the specific history of the city's port and the criminal networks that grew around that port, had become something that reached across the Atlantic and brought the consequences of that reach back to a car park in South Liverpool. The hitman's flight out of John Lennon Airport is the detail that encapsulates something important about how global that connection had become. The decision to kill was made elsewhere. The logistics of doing it were executed in Liverpool. The departure was through the city's international gateway, and no one was ever charged. The Hoyton firm, which would emerge in later years as the dominant force in Liverpool's cocaine trade, operated in a world that Smith's operation had helped to create. The Coggins brothers and the network they built around themselves in Hoyton and the surrounding areas of Knowsley inherited not just a market, but an established supply architecture, a set of international connections and distribution relationships that predated them and that they entered rather than created from nothing. That architecture had been built by Smith and by Warren before him, and by the men of Comerford's generation before that. The Colombian cartel that had authorized Smith's killing had been doing business with Liverpool for long enough that the relationship had its own history, its own precedents, its own internal logic about how disputes were resolved. His murder changed the calculation for everyone operating at his level in the city. The cartel's willingness to authorize a killing in England demonstrated something that had previously been a theoretical rather than a proven risk. If you owed the Colombians money at a certain scale, or if you had otherwise made yourself a problem that they needed to resolve, the fact of being in Liverpool was not protection. The reach extended to speak. It extended to a gym car park on a Tuesday morning. It extended far enough to put a hitman on a flight home a few hours later. That knowledge changed how the men who operated in Smith's world calculated their risks and their obligations. It was the kind of lesson that does not need to be stated explicitly to be understood. He was buried in Liverpool. The funeral, sources indicate, drew a significant number of people from the criminal and semi-criminal world of Merseyside, a gathering of people who had known him, worked with him, or profited from what he had built. The grief was real. The caution about who might be watching the gathering was equally real. £200 million, and a pump-action shotgun, and a car park in Speke. That is the full length of the arc. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Colin Smith built a £200 million cocaine empire in near-total obscurity, and was executed outside a gym in Speke, in a killing that has never produced a single charge. In the south of the same city, another man had been making his fortune from the traffickers rather than alongside them. Section 6. Stephen French and the Taxman of Toxteth. The relationship between the community and Merseyside police had been deteriorating for years under the pressure of stop-and-search powers applied with a consistency that residents experienced as targeted harassment rather than policing. When the riots came in July of that year, they came out of a specific place and a specific set of conditions, and the young men who stood on the front lines of the confrontations with police were products of exactly those conditions. One of them was 22 years old, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and would later describe himself as a frontline warrior during 9 days of some of the most serious civil unrest Britain had seen in the 20th century. His name was Stephen French. He would go on to build a criminal reputation in Liverpool that was different in character from anything that Warren or Smith or Comerford had constructed, not as a drug trafficker moving product through international supply chains, but as the man those traffickers feared most when he came to the door. French was born on the 8th of October 1958, in Toxteth. He grew up in the L8 district during a period when the area's racial and economic tensions were layering on top of each other in ways that produced a specific kind of young man, someone who had learned early that the formal structures of protection and opportunity available to other parts of the city were not reliably available to him, and who had developed alternative frameworks accordingly. He became a kickboxer. That fact is not incidental to what he later became. He trained with a seriousness and a physical commitment that took him to the level of British, European, and world champion titles, building a body and a set of skills that were, in the criminal economy he eventually entered, directly convertible into the currency of fear and capability. He was large, he was trained, and he had demonstrated in competitive settings that he could hurt people effectively and absorb punishment without stopping. In the world he was moving toward, those qualities had a specific market value. His criminal career began in the conventional fashion of his time and place. Petty theft, mugging, the small-scale operations of a young man finding the edges of what was available. The 1981 riots were a kind of accelerant, not because they created the conditions for his later career, but because they sharpened his understanding of how the city was divided and where he stood within it. When the riots ended and the television cameras left and the politicians made their observations about deprivation and policing and the need for investment, the streets of Toxteth returned to the state they had been in before, which was the state that had produced the riots. The structural conditions did not change. The men who had stood in the streets during 9 days of confrontation went back to their lives. French went back to his. What he developed through the 1980s and into the 1990s was an operation that occupied a specific and unusual position in the criminal ecosystem of Liverpool. He did not import drugs. He did not build a distribution network. He did not manage a street-level operation that moved product to users. What he did was substantially more direct. He identified drug dealers who had accumulated money and assets through their trade and he took those assets from them through force, the threat of force, and the particular psychological pressure that came from his physical presence and his reputation for following through on what he said he would do. This practice was known, in the language of the criminal world, as taxing. French was its preeminent practitioner in Liverpool during the years of his criminal operation, and he pursued it with a thoroughness and a professional dedication that were, by the accounts of those involved, genuinely terrifying to the people on the receiving end. The logic of the taxman's position in a criminal economy is worth understanding carefully. Drug dealers, by the nature of their trade, cannot report a robbery to the police. If someone takes their product, their cash, or their assets through violence, the legal protections available to ordinary citizens are not available to them without exposing themselves to prosecution. This creates a specific vulnerability that a man with French's capabilities could exploit systematically. His targets were people who had something worth taking, and no legitimate recourse when it was taken. He moved through Liverpool's drug economy, extracting money and assets, with the consistency of a man who understood that the victims of his approach were structurally unable to seek protection from conventional authority. The only response available to them was either to pay, to find someone capable of protecting them from him, or to come after him directly. Most paid. He was shot, he was stabbed, he was set on fire. These are facts he has discussed in his own public accounts of the period, and they indicate that the career was not without its physical consequences. There were people in the city's criminal world who were willing and able to attempt a violent response to what he was doing, and some of those attempts came close enough to the mark to leave permanent evidence. He survived all of them. The survival itself became part of the reputation, the understanding that physical responses to French had been tried and had not resolved the problem, which made the problem appear more durable and more dangerous than it might otherwise have seemed. Reputation in that world compounds. Each incident that he walked away from added to the account. Sources estimate the fortune he accumulated through this operation at over £20 million. The number is difficult to verify precisely given the nature of the income, which was neither declared nor invested through channels that left documentary traces in the conventional sense. What is established is that he operated for an extended period at a level of criminal income that placed him among the wealthier figures in Liverpool's underworld during the peak years of the cocaine trade, and that he did so without ever being the kind of principle that international law enforcement organizations built dossiers on in the way they built them on Warren or Smith. He was a local phenomenon in a specific sense. His operation was defined by the geography and the social relationships of the city in a way that the trafficking empires were not. He could not have done what he did in a city where he was unknown, because the taxman's power depends on the pre-existing fact of his reputation being understood by the people he is taxing. In Liverpool, it was understood. His convictions during this period were surprisingly limited given the scale of what he was doing. He served 2.5 years, a sentence completed by 1995, which, given the violence and the financial scale of his operation, represents a remarkable degree of legal insulation. The mechanisms by which he maintained that insulation are not fully documented, but the structural logic of his position offers some explanation. His victims could not easily testify against him without exposing themselves. Witnesses in the communities where he operated had reasons to be cautious about cooperation with police, and the nature of the crimes, which were violent and financially motivated, but which targeted people who were themselves engaged in serious criminality, placed them in a different investigative category than the trafficking operations that were the primary focus of Merseyside Police's organised crime resources during the same period. The period around 1995 brought a significant event to the Toxteth criminal world that touched the edges of French's operation. A man named Maguire, part of the criminal landscape of the district, was shot dead in a gang confrontation in 1998 by Darren Bequan, a gunman whose name was known in the city's criminal circles. Bequan was jailed in 2000 for the murder of Maguire and another man named Nathan Jones, a sequence of violence that reflected the degree to which the armed conflict between individuals and factions in Toxteth during this period was running alongside and sometimes intersecting with the larger trafficking operations that were the more visible face of Liverpool's organised crime. French moved through this environment with the authority of someone who had established a particular position within it, not as a participant in the gang conflicts over territory and drug markets, but as someone whose role was definitionally extractive from all of those conflicts simultaneously. The turn in his life came through an experience he has described in subsequent public accounts as religious in character. He was, by his own account, in the process of planning to kill a man with whom he had a serious dispute, a dispute serious enough that beheading had entered his calculation as a method of resolution, when an experience he describes as spiritual intervention redirected him. He pistol-whipped the man instead. He has presented this as evidence of his conversion, which gives some indication of the scale of violence that constituted a moderated response in the world he was operating in. He subsequently underwent what he describes as a genuine religious transformation, repositioning himself as a Christian preacher and anti-violence activist, taking on the alternative nickname of the Fighting Preacher to replace the one he had carried through his criminal career. The public profile that followed was genuine in the sense that it was sustained and visible. He appeared on the television program Danny Dyer's Deadliest Men in 2008, in the first episode of a series that visited Britain's most dangerous former criminals, and the appearance brought him to a national audience that his criminal career had not. He wrote a book titled The Devil, which gave an account of his years in Liverpool's criminal world from his own perspective. He worked with young people in communities affected by gang violence, presenting his own history as a cautionary account rather than a template. He attended events at Liverpool Football Club in VIP areas, a detail that underlines how completely his public positioning had shifted from the man who had spent the 1980s and 1990s moving through Toxteth, extracting money from drug dealers by force. The complications in that repositioning were real and occasionally public. A reported incident in 2024 at Anfield, involving a confrontation with a steward, suggested that the boundaries between the reformed public figure and the habits of a long criminal career were not always cleanly maintained. These are the kinds of details that appear in accounts of his life without being fully resolved, markers of the difficulty of the transition he was attempting to make, and the degree to which a reputation built over decades does not simply dissolve because its holder has decided to build a different one. His legacy in Liverpool's criminal history is unusual precisely because of what he was not. He was not a drug lord, he was not a network builder, he was not a man whose operation left the structural traces that Warrens or Smiths did in the organization of the trade. He was the man those networks feared, the violence at the edge of the economy, rather than the economy itself. The taxman's role is definitionally parasitic on the existence of the drug economy, which means that everything Commerford built and Warren expanded, and Smith consolidated, was also the foundation of what French extracted. He required them, in a structural sense, even if they did not require him. The £20 million he is estimated to have accumulated represents the cost of operating a drug economy in Liverpool during his years of activity, a tax paid in fear rather than in product or cash flows, extracted by a kickboxing champion from Toxteth who survived being shot and stabbed and set on fire and walked out of it to become a preacher. The city contains all of this simultaneously: the cathedral and the car park, the port and the prison, the man who built the first drug cartel, and the man who taxed the ones that came after. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stephen French accumulated an estimated £20 million by taxing the drug dealers that law enforcement was pursuing through conventional means, surviving being shot, stabbed, and set on fire before walking away into a public religious conversion. In the north of the city, 2 housing estates were building toward a confrontation that would kill an 11-year-old boy. Section 7. The Croxteth Crew, the Strand Gang, and the death of Rhys Jones. On the evening of the 22nd of August 2007, the day before the first anniversary of Liam Smith's murder, an 11-year-old boy named Rhys Jones walked home from football practice across the car park of the Fir Tree Public House on Dovecot Road in Croxteth. Rhys was a dedicated supporter of Everton Football Club. He had been at training and was taking the route home that cut through the car park, a short distance from the house, where he lived with his parents Steve and Mel Jones. He was wearing his football kit. A 16-year-old member of the Croxteth crew named Sean Mercer was in the car park that evening, on a bicycle, carrying a World War I-era pistol. He had come to the car park to shoot at members of the Strand Gang who had entered Croxteth territory. The intended target was a Strand Gang member named Wayne Brady. Mercer fired 3 shots. One of them missed Brady. One of them hit Rhys Jones in the neck. Rhys fell in the car park. He was taken to Alder Hey Children's Hospital, where he died of his injuries. He was 11 years old. The murder produced a national response of a kind that few events in the modern history of British gang crime have matched. The image of a child in a football shirt, killed by a stray bullet on his way home from practice, became the image through which the country processed a conversation about gang violence, youth crime, gun availability, and the failure of social infrastructure in the most deprived urban communities. Politicians made statements. Commentators wrote at length about what Rhys Jones's death said about Britain. Merseyside police launched what became one of the largest investigations the force had ever conducted, deploying resources across the north of the city and pressing communities that had long-standing reasons to be cautious about cooperation with police to provide information about who had fired the shot. The investigation faced the specific obstacle that defines gang crime prosecutions in tight-knit communities. The people who knew what had happened had reasons not to say so. The culture of the estates, built around a specific understanding of what cooperation with police meant for personal safety, meant that information moved slowly into the official investigation and quickly through informal channels. Merseyside police worked the case for over a year. The breakthrough, when it came, was the product of patient intelligence work and the gradual erosion of a wall of silence that the Croxteth crew and the community around them had maintained with considerable determination in the months after the shooting. Sean Mercer was identified as the shooter. He was arrested. He was 17 by the time the case came to trial. The 9-week trial at Liverpool Crown Court began in autumn 2008 and produced, on the 16th of December of that year, a guilty verdict. Mercer, by then 18 years old, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, meaning he would not be eligible for parole consideration until he was at least 40 years old and the year was at least 2030. The judge's remarks condemned what was described as the brutality and cowardice of Liverpool's gang culture. The sentencing of Mercer was followed by convictions for a series of other gang members whose roles had been established during the investigation. James Yates, who was 20 at the time of the original offence, and who had supplied the gun that Mercer used, was convicted of assisting an offender and jailed for 7 years, alongside Gary Kays and Melvin Coy, who received the same term. Nathan Quinn and a youth referred to as Boy M, who could not be named because he was still under 18 at sentencing, were also convicted of assisting an offender. A defendant referred to as Boy K, later identified as Dean Kelly, was convicted of 4 related offences. The web of young men who had been involved in the events of that evening, in the supply of the weapon, the disposal of evidence, and the concealment of information from police, was substantially dismantled by the prosecution. Yates was released at some point after serving his sentence and breached his licence conditions, resulting in his recall to prison, a detail that emerged in later reporting and that indicated the difficulty of the reintegration process for young men convicted in connection with gang-related offences whose original community networks remained largely intact. The gun itself was a detail that carried a particular weight in the reporting and analysis of the case. A World War I-era pistol, an antique weapon of the kind that had entered circulation in Liverpool and other British cities through channels that law enforcement had struggled to fully map, had been put in the hands of a 16-year-old boy on a housing estate in North Liverpool and used to kill a child. The availability of firearms in the city was not a new phenomenon. Sources indicate that the National Crime Agency's own analysis found that 70% of traced links to weapons in the United Kingdom led back to Liverpool and the northwest of England, a figure that reflects the degree to which the city had developed, over the decades of the drug wars, a specific and durable infrastructure for the acquisition, storage, circulation and use of firearms that was without parallel in most other British cities. The rivalry between the Croxteth crew and the Strand Gang was rooted in the drug market disputes of North Liverpool's housing estates, but it had by 2007 taken on the characteristics of a feud that was being pursued for its own sake, independent of any particular commercial logic. The killing of Liam Smith outside Old Course Prison in 2006 had been a drug market action with a territorial message. The events of the 22nd of August 2007 were the consequence of the retaliation cycle that Smith's killing had accelerated. Wayne Brady, the intended target who escaped harm, was a Strand Gang member whose presence in Croxteth territory that evening represented the kind of provocation that the cycle of the feud demanded a response to. Mercer's response killed the wrong person. It killed someone who had nothing to do with any of it. Rhys Jones's parents, Steve and Mel Jones, became public figures in the aftermath of their son's murder in ways that they had not chosen and did not welcome, but that they navigated with a consistency and a dignity that became part of the public record of the case. Mel Jones's testimony about who her son had been, a boy who loved Everton, who was chatty and kind, and who had been walking home from football practice in the early evening of a summer day, was the human center of a case that was otherwise built around the institutional dysfunction and the street-level violence of a gang culture that most people watching from outside the L11 postcode experienced as remote and difficult to fully comprehend. She spoke about the ordinary quality of her son's life in a way that made the randomness and the waste of what had happened to him impossible to process without grief. The detective work that produced the convictions was subsequently examined in detail through a number of accounts and documentaries, including the television drama Little Boy Blue, which was broadcast in 2017 and which brought the investigation back into national attention a decade after the murder. The drama depicted the work of the investigating officers and the resistance they encountered from within the community in ways that gave a general audience a close account of what a complex gang crime murder investigation looks like from the inside. The broadcast generated renewed discussion about gun crime in Liverpool and prompted Merseyside Police's senior investigating officer, Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Green, to give interviews in which he acknowledged that the murder of Rhys Jones had not, as he had hoped it might, functioned as a watershed moment that changed the relationship between the city's young men and firearms. His words on this point were precise and bleak. Some, he said, were still only too willing to pick up a firearm to protect territory, illegal businesses, or to settle petty disputes. The estates where the Croxteth crew and the Strand gang had operated had changed, he acknowledged, partly through community regeneration work and partly through sustained policing. A centre named after Rhys Jones had been opened in Croxteth, offering apprenticeships and youth activities, with all-weather football pitches and a mosaic of Everton Football Club on its walls. Crime in Croxteth was reported to have fallen by 35% in the years following the murder. But Green was careful to note that the reduction in one area did not mean the reduction of the underlying problem. It meant that the problem had moved, displaced to other estates in other parts of the city, to Bootle and Kirkby and Fazakerley, to communities that had less capacity to absorb its consequences and less visibility in the conversations that followed high-profile events. The Croxteth crew and the Strand gang were not, in the criminal taxonomy of Liverpool, the major organised crime groups that imported and distributed drugs at volume. They were street-level territorial organisations whose primary function was the control of local drug markets and the assertion of dominance over specific patches of North Liverpool. The men at the top of the Liverpool cocaine trade, the figures who dealt directly with continental European suppliers and who managed distribution networks covering multiple regions, regarded the gang warfare of the housing estates as a management problem rather than a feature of their own operations. The violence and the attention it attracted complicated the environment in which they operated. It brought police resources into areas where those resources disrupted the infrastructure they depended on. It was, from the perspective of the principals in the trafficking economy, bad for business. What the Croxteth and Norris Green conflict represented, alongside the immediate human tragedy of Rhys Jones's death, was a demonstration of the degree to which Liverpool's criminal economy had created a layer of street-level violence that operated according to its own internal logic. The feud between the two estates was not being managed by any central authority in the city's criminal world. No one was directing it toward a commercial objective. It was running on the fuel of accumulated grievances, retaliations, and the particular logic of young men in environments of concentrated poverty and limited legitimate options, for whom the assertion of territorial dominance was one of the few available forms of status. The gun that killed Rhys Jones was not in the hands of a principal of the cocaine trade. It was in the hands of a 16-year-old boy on a bicycle who fired it in the car park of a public house in North Liverpool and then rode away, while a child he had not meant to shoot lay dying on the tarmac. Mercer remains in prison. His minimum term expires in 2030, at which point he will face a parole process that will assess whether he is safe to release into a world that has changed substantially in the years he has spent inside. He was 16 when he fired the shot. He has spent his entire adult life in custody. Whatever he is when the parole board considers his case will be the product of those years and not of the person who rode a bicycle into a car park in Croxteth in the late evening of the 22nd of August 2007. Rhys Jones would be in his late 20s now. He would have seen Everton play at Goodison Park many hundreds of times by this point, if the bullet had missed. He would have watched them move to their new stadium. He would have had a life of the kind that is available to most people who grow up in a city with 2 football teams and a waterfront, and a history that runs all the way back to the ships that made it rich and the poverty that those ships produced alongside the wealth. He did not get any of that. He got the car park and the ambulance and Alder Hay and the morning when his parents understood what had happened, and the morning when the country understood it too. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sean Mercer was 16 when he fired the shot that killed Rhys Jones and is serving a minimum of 22 years. In the Hoyton area of Knowsley, a pair of brothers had been building something far more organized and far more durable for 30 years, and their undoing came through technology that did not exist when they started. Section 8. The Hoyton Firm and the messages that brought them down Croxdale Road. West is a residential street in Hoyton, a district in the borough of Knowsley that sits to the east of Liverpool, beyond the outer ring of the city's northern estates, and into the territory that carries a different postcode, but shares the same criminal geography. At some point in the period between 2019 and 2020, a stash house on that street, belonging to one of the most secretive and durable organised crime groups in the north of England, was raided by a team of men who had been told, by someone close to the operation, that the house was worth hitting. They went in and came out with approximately 30 kilograms of cocaine. The street value of what they took was over £1 million. The men who owned that cocaine were not the kind of people who absorbed a loss of that size without a response. The response they planned, and the messages in which they planned it, would eventually be read by law enforcement officers who had cracked the encrypted communications platform the group used to conduct its business. Those messages would result in the longest series of convictions for organised crime that Merseyside had seen in a generation. But first, the wrong people were blamed, and what followed from that era illustrated more clearly than almost anything else in this account what it meant to owe the Hoyton firm an answer they were not satisfied with. Vincent Coggins and his older brother Francis had been running the Hoyton firm for approximately 30 years before Operation Venetic brought them into a courtroom. The group had been named in law enforcement intelligence for years, known to exist, known to be significant, known to be rooted in the Hoyton and Stockbridge village areas of Knowsley. What had eluded investigators for 3 decades was the evidence required to prosecute. The Coggins brothers had maintained their operational security with a consistency that was, in retrospect, the central achievement of their criminal careers. They were not public figures. They did not accumulate the kind of visible profile that created documentary trails. Vincent, of Woodpecker close in West Derby, and Francis, originally from Stockbridge Village, ran a structure that kept them insulated from the physical movement of product and the kinds of transaction-level communications that generated interceptable evidence. They had, in the language of serious organised crime, survived long enough to build something substantial precisely because they were careful in ways that earlier Liverpool crime figures had not always been. The operation they ran at its peak was substantial by any measure. Between October 2019 and June 2020, the period for which the most detailed evidence was eventually assembled, the brothers were responsible for the importation of at least 1.013 tons of cocaine and heroin into the United Kingdom, with a minimum wholesale value of £16.2 million. Francis, operating from mainland Europe and eventually from the Netherlands, managed the importation side of the business, negotiating directly with suppliers and coordinating the movement of product across the continent and into Britain. Vincent managed the domestic operation, overseeing distribution across England, Wales and Scotland, collecting money and making the decisions about what happened when problems arose. The brothers communicated regularly, discussing shipments, prices, debts and personnel in a manner that was frank and detailed, because they believed with complete confidence that the platform through which they were communicating was impenetrable. EncroChat was a commercially produced encrypted communications system that operated on modified handsets and offered its users end-to-end encryption of messages, along with features designed to make the interception of communications as difficult as possible. The devices cost over £1,000 each and were sold through criminal networks to people who understood what they were buying. By 2019, EncroChat had become the dominant communications platform for organised crime groups across Europe, with tens of thousands of users who believed that the encryption was sufficient protection against law enforcement interception. The Hoyton firm was among those users. Vincent and Francis communicated through the platform. Their associates communicated through it. The messages they sent were candid in ways that face-to-face conversations, which leave no record, are. They discussed shipments in specific terms. They discussed the prices of kilogram quantities of cocaine and heroin. They discussed the people who owed them money and what should happen to those people if the money did not arrive. They discussed violence with the directness of men who believed they were talking in a room that no one else could enter. In June 2020, a European law enforcement task force that had spent months penetrating the EncroChat infrastructure brought the platform down. On the 13th of that month, EncroChat's administrators, understanding that the system had been compromised, sent a message to all users instructing them to turn off and destroy their devices. The instruction came too late for the Coggins operation. Officers from Merseyside Police and the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit had already moved into their arrest phase. On the 16th of June 2020, coordinated warrants across Liverpool and Knowsley brought in Vincent Coggins, Paul Woodford, Michael Earl and Kevin Rimmer before they had time to act on the warning. More than 72,000 messages had been retrieved from the EncroChat server. The investigators who spent the months after the arrests working through those messages found in them a detailed record of the operation that would have taken years to assemble through conventional surveillance. What the messages showed went beyond the logistics of drug supply. They showed Vincent Coggins ordering violent attacks against individuals. They showed him discussing, in specific terms, the people he wanted hurt and the methods he was prepared to sanction. They showed Francis sending photographs of blocks of cocaine and the brothers negotiating over a deal for half a ton of the drug, valued at approximately £16 million. They showed the brothers discussing an individual they referred to as Piggy, described in the messages in terms that indicated a corrupt insider with connections to law enforcement who was providing the operation with information about police activity. The existence of a corrupt insider in the network was one of the more alarming details to emerge from the messages, and it indicated the degree to which the Hoyton firm had invested in protecting itself at multiple levels simultaneously. The robbery of the Croxdale Road West stash house had taken place before the EncroChat platform was taken down, and the messages from the period after the robbery showed Vincent Coggins's response in real time. He suspected specific individuals of having organized the theft. His suspicions, as it would eventually emerge, were wrong. The people he believed were responsible had nothing to do with the robbery. Nonetheless, the pressure he applied to those people was severe. A property valued at over £1 million was extorted from individuals who had been wrongly identified as participants in the robbery. The exchange of the property for their personal safety. The extortion was blackmail on the scale of an asset transfer, and it proceeded under the threat of violence that was credible given everything the Hoyton firm was known to be capable of. The actual perpetrators of the robbery were the Cox brothers, Jason and Craig, from Salford, who had been given the information about the stash house by a former customer of the Coggins operation named Richard Caswell. The Cox brothers went in knowing what was there and came out with the cocaine. Jason Cox was sentenced to 14 years and 8 months in August 2023, following a Greater Manchester police investigation called Operation Geladi into the robbery and the machete attacks carried out on the occupants of the stash house. Craig Cox received 13 years and 6 months, later reduced on appeal to 11 years. A third brother, Lee Cox, was jailed for 8 years for separate criminal activity. Caswell was also prosecuted. The violence used during the robbery, the machete attacks on the people inside the house, added a layer of serious assault to what was already a significant drugs and organized crime prosecution. The EncroChat messages also revealed a connection to a man named Thomas Cashman, who was at the time operating as a drug dealer in Liverpool and who was a customer of the Hoyton firm's distribution network. The messages showed Cashman communicating with Vincent Coggins about various matters related to the drug supply operation. The significance of that connection would become clear later, when Cashman's own actions produced a consequence that had nothing to do with the Hoyton firm's prosecution, but that connected the two stories in a way that the courts would eventually acknowledge. The sentences handed down to the Hoyton firm's members were substantial. Vincent Coggins pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and conspiracy to commit blackmail, and was sentenced to 28 years. Paul Woodford, who had been alongside Coggins at the centre of the operation, received 24 years and 6 months. Kevin Rimmer, who had played a significant role in the domestic supply network, was jailed for 16 years. Darren Tierney received 12 years and 9 months. Paul Fitzsimmons, who had been in the Amsterdam area and was arrested after more than 2 years on the run, received 12 years and 6 months. Michael Earl received 11 years. The combined sentences for the initial group of 9 defendants exceeded 155 years. Edward Jarvis, of Breckside Park in Anfield, was the last member of the group to be convicted, found guilty after a trial at Manchester Crown Court of cocaine and heroin trafficking and conspiracy to blackmail. Jarvis was 58 years old at conviction. and had a previous conviction from 2005 for a plot to flood Europe with approximately £48 million worth of cocaine, a detail that placed him in the category of career serious criminals whose involvement in organised drug trafficking stretched across decades. His conviction closed 4 years of court proceedings against the group. Francis Coggins, the older brother, was not in the country when the arrests came. He had established himself in the Dutch coastal town of Zandvoort, a modest seaside town on the North Sea coast between Haarlem and Amsterdam, and had maintained himself there for 5 years, while his brother served his sentence and the investigation into the wider network continued. He was arrested in June 2025, not as the result of a coordinated law enforcement operation identifying his location, but because he was found drunk and disorderly by local police in Zandvoort. The manner of his arrest, a wanted man brought in for public intoxication in a Dutch seaside town, was an anticlimactic end to 5 years of successful evasion. He was extradited to England and appeared at Liverpool Crown Court, where he pleaded guilty to conspiracies to import and to supply cocaine and heroin. The court heard that between May 2019 and October 2020, he had arranged the importation of at least 1.013 tons of cocaine and heroin, with a minimum wholesale value of £16.2 million. He was sentenced to 18 years. The Hoyton firm had operated for 30 years without producing a significant prosecution of its leadership. The platform that was supposed to make continued operations safe was the thing that ended it. The messages the brothers sent to each other, the photographs of cocaine blocks, the discussions of prices and debts and violence, the references to a corrupt police insider, the planning of a hand grenade attack against the men they wrongly believed had robbed their stash house. All of it survived the destruction of the handsets because it had already been copied from the server before the administrators sent their warning. The archive of the operation existed in the hands of law enforcement before the Coggins brothers knew their communications had been read. Olivia Pratt-Corbell's mother, Cheryl Corbell, responding to Vincent Coggins's 28-year sentence, said that no amount of years would ever be enough. She said she believed that the violence in Liverpool might not have escalated as badly as it did if the authorities had found the Coggins brothers a great deal earlier. It had taken 30 years to find them, she noted, and what that said about how deeply embedded the operation was and how long it had been allowed to function was something she could not set aside. She was speaking as the mother of the child whose death was connected, through Thomas Cashman and through the drug economy the Hoyton firm had helped to sustain, to the operation that had just been sentenced. The connection between a 30-year criminal enterprise in Hoyton and a 9-year-old girl shot dead on a doorstep in Dovecot was the distance between a supply chain decision and the violence that supply chains produce at their furthest edges. That distance had collapsed in the most terrible way on the 22nd of August 2022. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Hoyton firm ran for 30 years before their own EncroChat messages brought them down, with Vincent Coggins jailed for 28 years and Francis extradited from a Dutch seaside town 5 years after the arrests began. The drug dealer at the end of their supply chain had by then already fired the shot that made his name the most hated in Liverpool. Section 9. Thomas Cashman and the murder of Olivia Pratt-Corbell. On the evening of the 22nd of August, 2022, a Monday, the streets around Kingsheath Avenue were ordinary in the way that residential streets in British cities are ordinary at 10 o'clock at night. Children were inside. The day was ending. Cheryl Corbell was at home with her daughters. Her youngest child, 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell, was with her. Somewhere nearby, a man named Joseph Nee, 35 years old, a convicted drug dealer with a criminal record that included burglary offences, was moving through the streets with the particular urgency of someone who understood that another man was behind him and that the man behind him was armed and intended to use what he was carrying. Nee ran. He reached the front door of Cheryl Corbell's house and pushed his way through it. Cheryl tried to push the door closed against him. The man behind Nee, Thomas Cashman, was still firing. One bullet passed through Cheryl Corbell's wrist. The same bullet entered Olivia's chest. She was taken to Alder Hey Children's Hospital. She was pronounced dead that night. She was 9 years old. She had been born on the 13th of June 2013. Thomas Cashman was 33 years old at the time of the shooting. He was from Grenadier Drive in West Derby, a district of North Liverpool not far from the Hoyton territory, where the Coggins brothers had run their operation. His criminal record contained 18 previous convictions for 33 offences, accumulated across a career that had begun modestly and grown steadily toward the scale of operation he was running by the summer of 2022. He had started dealing cannabis at a small level and increased that operation over time until, at the point of his arrest, he was earning between £3,000 and £5,000 a week from the supply of large quantities. He was a customer of the Hoyton firm's distribution network, connected to Vincent Coggins through the supply chain that the EncroChat messages had documented. His name appeared in those messages. The relationship between Cashman and the Coggins operation was a commercial one, buyer and supplier, the kind of relationship that structured the lower tiers of a distribution network built from the top down. The debt that Nee owed Cashman was the trigger for what happened in Kings Heath Avenue, though the full details of that debt and its origins were not exhaustively established in court in ways that produced a simple narrative. What was established was that Cashman had been pursuing Nee over a financial dispute connected to the drug trade, and that the pursuit had escalated to the point where Cashman was moving through the streets of Dovecot on the night of the 22nd of August with a firearm and an intention to use it. He had fired before he reached Cheryl Corbell's door. The shots that preceded the doorstep sequence were fired in the street at Nee as he ran. Nee survived. He had a criminal record and was not an innocent party to the events that preceded the shooting, but he was alive when Olivia was not, a fact that her family would be required to carry for the rest of their lives. The investigation that followed was one of the largest Merseyside police had mounted in years. The force had learned from the Rhys Jones investigation 15 years earlier how to manage the particular challenge of extracting information from communities where cooperation with police was complicated by fear and by the social architecture of the criminal world. They deployed forensic analysis of CCTV footage from across the area, mapping Cashman's movements before and after the shooting, with a precision that the availability of cameras across a modern British city made possible in ways that it had not been in 2007. They analysed phone data. They worked the intelligence picture around Cashman's known associates and his position in the drug supply network that the Hoyton firm's prosecution had already partly illuminated. In September 2022, officers arrested him on suspicion of murder. The bodycam footage of that arrest was later released and showed Cashman being taken into custody on a street in Liverpool, looking directly at the officers and saying nothing of significance. The trial took place at Manchester Crown Court, relocated from Liverpool, in accordance with standard practice for high-profile cases where the proximity of the crime and the defendant to the jury pool creates grounds for a change of venue. The prosecution laid out the evidence across a number of weeks: the CTV reconstruction of Cashman's movements, the forensic analysis of the firearm, a handgun, the trajectory of the bullet that had passed through Cheryl Corbell's wrist and entered her daughter's chest, the evidence of Cashman's drug-dealing operation, his earnings, his position in the network. The jury heard from Cheryl Corbell, who described attempting to push the door closed against Nee as Cashman fired, and who asked, in the witness box, how Cashman had continued to fire after hearing the terrified screams and understanding the devastation he was causing. The jury deliberated for just over 9 hours before returning guilty verdicts on the charge of murder, the charge of attempted murder in relation to Nee, the charges of wounding with intent in relation to Cheryl Corbell, and 2 counts of possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. On the 3rd of April 2023, Thomas Cashman was due to appear in the dock at Manchester Crown Court to be sentenced. He did not come out of his cell. His barrister informed the court that Cashman had said the proceedings were turning into a circus and that he would not attend. Mrs. Justice Yip, presiding, called his non-attendance disrespectful and proceeded with the sentencing in his absence. She imposed a mandatory life sentence for the murder of Olivia Pratt Corbell, with a minimum term of 42 years. He would not be eligible for parole consideration until he had served those 42 years, placing any possible release date well beyond his 70th birthday. She also sentenced him for the other offences, with those sentences to run concurrently with the life term. The 42-year minimum term was among the longest handed down for murder in recent British legal history. The judge's remarks noted that the murder was chilling, that Cashman had shown no remorse, and that he had not acknowledged any responsibility for what he had done. She observed that the mental scars from that night would remain with Cheryl Corbell and the wider family permanently. Outside the court, Cheryl Corbell spoke about her daughter in terms that were direct and devastating. She described Olivia as her little love, her shadow, and said that Cashman had left the biggest hole in their lives. She expressed relief that justice had prevailed, while acknowledging that her family had begun their own life sentence, the sentence of spending the rest of their lives without Olivia. Cashman subsequently attempted to appeal against his sentence, arguing through his legal team that 42 years was excessive and that he should serve less time before parole eligibility was considered. The Court of Appeal rejected his application without requiring a full hearing. He renewed the application, and a hearing was fixed. The renewed application was also ultimately unsuccessful. He remains in custody. His conviction has also been appealed, and the application for leave to appeal against conviction was lodged after the sentence appeals had been dealt with. As of the latest available records, those proceedings had not produced a different outcome. The connection between Cashman and the Highton firm, established through the EncroChat messages that formed the backbone of the Coggins prosecution, was acknowledged in the court proceedings around both cases. The messages between Cashman and Vincent Coggins documented a commercial relationship within the drug supply network. They also showed Coggins dealing with a situation that arose when Cashman was accused, wrongly according to the court's eventual finding of facts, of robbing one of the Highton firm's stash houses. Donovan, the man referred to in other proceedings as a go-between, was identified in material emerging from the Highton firm's prosecution as having played a role in those discussions. The web of relationships connecting the different nodes of Liverpool's organised crime network in the period between 2019 and 2022 was dense enough that the prosecution of one group consistently produced threads that led into the prosecution of others. The broader question that Olivia's murder forced into public discussion was one that Merseyside police and successive governments had been unable to fully answer for decades. The availability of firearms in Liverpool, documented in the National Crime Agency's finding that 70% of traced weapon links in the United Kingdom led back to Liverpool and the Northwest, meant that a man pursuing a debt through the streets of Dovecot could do so with a handgun in a way that the geography of most other British cities would have made more difficult. The gun in Cashman's hand had come from somewhere. The infrastructure that allowed it to be sourced, stored, and passed to him when he needed it was the same infrastructure that had been developing since the door wars of the 1990s and the gang conflicts of the 2000s and the generations of criminal organisation before that. Olivia Pratt-Corbell was killed by a bullet from a specific firearm held by a specific man, and she was also killed by the cumulative weight of a criminal economy that had been building in Liverpool for 50 years. Cheryl Corbell, in the period after sentencing, became an advocate for legislative change. She supported efforts to introduce a law that would impose tougher penalties on defendants who refused to attend their own sentencing hearings, a reform directly prompted by Cashman's refusal to leave his cell. The proposal, which drew on Olivia's case as its central example, reflected the degree to which the family had chosen to convert their grief into something that might prevent others from experiencing the same absence of accountability that Cashman's empty chair had represented. The reform was described by Cheryl as something that would keep her daughter's legacy alive. It was a way of insisting that the proceedings of a court had a dignity that could not be cancelled by a defendant's decision to stay in his cell and call it a circus. Olivia's father, John Pratt, gave a statement at sentencing that was read by the prosecution. He described seeing his daughter for the first time in 2 years, the day before she was killed, a visit that the pandemic had delayed and that became, without either of them knowing it, the last time they would be together. He described sitting outside the cemetery, but being unable to go inside because if he did, it would all seem too real. He said he sometimes just wanted it to end so that he could be with her. These were the words of a man sitting at the furthest point of the grief that a bullet fired in the pursuit of a drug debt had created, and they were spoken into a courtroom from which the man responsible had absented himself. Olivia Pratt-Corbell was 9 years old. She had been born in the summer of 2013 into a city that contained everything described in this account. The docks that Comerford had used as a gateway, the Toxteth streets that had shaped Warren and Showers and French, the North Liverpool estates where Mercer had fired the shot that killed Rhys Jones, the Hoyton streets where the Coggins brothers had built 30 years of operation, and the court records and the prison sentences, and the encrypted messages and the arms caches, and the Colombian hitman and all the rest of it. None of it was visible to her. She was 9 years old and she was in her house with her mother on a Monday night in August. The door opened and Nee came through it and Cashman was still firing, and that was the end of it. Mrs. Justice Yip said the murder was chilling. The word is accurate and it is insufficient. 42 years is the minimum. He will be past 70 before a parole board considers his case. She would have been in her late 30s by then. She would have seen things. She would have had a life of a particular shape that cannot now be known because it did not happen. The court records fix the end of it with a precision that the life itself, which was 9 years and 2 months long, does not invite. She liked Everton. She was sassy and chatty. She was her mother's shadow. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Thomas Cashman was sentenced to a minimum of 42 years for the murder of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell, refusing to leave his cell to hear it. The final section covers the man who killed a police officer, walked out of prison, and immediately built a £13 million criminal empire known to others on Merseyside by a single word. Section 10. Timmy Donovan, the cop killer and the 13 million. In the early hours of the 19th of December, 2014, a group of Merseyside police officers were on a Christmas night out on that street. They were off duty. They were in plain clothes. One of them was a constable named Neil Doyle, 36 years old, who had served with Merseyside Police for 10 years. Doyle and his colleagues became involved in a confrontation with a group of men in the early hours of that morning. The confrontation escalated. Doyle was struck by a single punch, described in court as a pile driver, delivered with a force that ruptured the vertebral artery in his neck. He died on the street. His colleagues, some of whom were also attacked during the same confrontation, were unable to help him. The men who had thrown the punches carried on with their evening. 2 of them were eventually convicted. Timmy Donovan, 30 years old at the time, of Walsingham Road in Liverpool, was convicted of manslaughter at Liverpool Crown Court in 2015, alongside Andrew Taylor. Donovan was sentenced to 6 years. He served 3 on licence. He walked out of prison in 2018, returned to Liverpool, and within a short time had become one of the most significant figures in the city's drug supply and money laundering economy. The National Crime Agency, working through Operation Venetic in the aftermath of the EncroChat takedown, eventually found this out in detail. The details were considerable. On the EncroChat platform, Donovan operated under the handle Astral Cleaner. It was an odd choice for a man whose activities were anything but clean, but the handles on EncroChat were not chosen for their symbolism. They were chosen for anonymity. And Donovan, like the other serious criminals who paid over £1,000 for a modified handset and a subscription to what they believed was an impenetrable encrypted system, chose a name that would mean nothing to anyone who did not already know what it referred to. What the NCA's investigators found in his Astral Cleaner messages when they accessed the server was a complete operational record of a man who had returned to serious organised crime within weeks of leaving prison after killing a police officer, and had built, in the space of less than 2 years, an enterprise of considerable scale and structural sophistication. The operation Donovan ran between December 2019 and June 2020 was built around 2 primary functions. The first was drug supply. The Astral Cleaner messages showed him coordinating the wholesale supply of cocaine and heroin to other criminals across Merseyside, discussing shipments in terms that revealed both the volume of what he was handling and the breadth of his connections. He sent messages asking for any news on the far ones, a reference, investigators established, to container ships transporting cocaine from South America into European ports. He negotiated the price of what he referred to as bots and tops, which were kilogram quantities of heroin and cocaine respectively. He admitted at his eventual guilty plea to having conspired to supply 23.7 kilograms of cocaine and 1 kilogram of heroin during the period. He had no declared income. He was on license from a manslaughter conviction. The second function of the operation was the movement and cleaning of the money that the drug supply generated. Between £10 and £13 million passed through the network that Donovan coordinated during the period covered by the charges. The movement of that money required a system of people and accounts and physical spaces that was more complex than the drug supply itself, because cash in those quantities cannot simply be deposited in a bank without generating the kind of automated reporting that financial institutions are legally required to produce for transactions above certain thresholds. The system Donovan used was layered. Cash was collected from debtors and suppliers by couriers, counted and packaged by people at a level below Donovan in the structure, and then fed into the financial system through a series of third-party business accounts that made the money appear to originate from legitimate commercial activity. The specific mechanism that the NCA's investigation exposed in greatest detail was the role of a car dealership on the High Street in Wavertree. Christopher Roper, 41 years old, of Allerton Road in Liverpool, worked at the Wavertree Car Centre and used that position to store large quantities of criminal cash on behalf of Donovan's operation. Roper communicated on EncroChat under the handle Sentient Wolf. He arranged transfers of cash through third-party accounts, receiving a fee of 4.5% of the amount he processed in return for the service. The Wavertree Car Centre was not a front in the conventional sense, a business established specifically for criminal purposes. It was an existing commercial operation that had been enlisted into the money laundering architecture through Roper's willingness to provide the service Donovan needed. A legitimate business, its name above the door, its cars on the forecourt, processing criminal cash through its accounts at 4.5% commission. This model, the insertion of criminal money into the cash flows of real businesses rather than the construction of fake ones, is one of the harder variants of money laundering to detect, precisely because the host business is genuinely trading. Donovan managed the debt collection and the cash flow with the attention of a man running a legitimate operation. A spreadsheet found on his devices recorded £3,424,000 owed to him in England alone. Multiple messages documented his interest in the packaging of money, the physical process of preparing cash for counting and transfer, which indicated that he was thinking about the logistics of the financial side of the operation, with the same care he was applying to the supply side. Almost every door in his house had been specially reinforced when NCA officers arrived to arrest him. The reinforcement of doors is a specific response to a specific threat, and it reflects the world Donovan was operating in, where the people who might want access to what was inside a house were not limited to law enforcement. The other members of his organized crime group had roles that were defined with the same structural logic. Aaron O'Sullivan, 41, of Deepfield Drive in Hoyton, operated on EncroChat as both Filthy Burrito and Ampleby, and supplied cocaine for the network, while also assisting in the collection and movement of money. O'Sullivan was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months. Kenneth Keane, 59, of Hoyton House Road, and Paul Duncan, 56, of Gentwood Road in Liverpool, worked as couriers, physically transporting cash between the people who collected it and the people who processed it. James Vaughan, 38, of Green Lane in Liverpool, was Donovan's brother-in-law. He collected, stored and counted cash, a role that required both physical proximity to large quantities of criminal money and the trust that came with a family connection. When the arrests came, Vaughan ran. He made it to Spain and stayed there long enough to appear on the National Crime Agency's Most Wanted Fugitives list. He was extradited back to the United Kingdom in March 2024, following collaborative work between the CPS, the NCA, and Spanish authorities. He was brought back to face charges that his months in Spain had not diminished. Christopher Roper pleaded guilty on the eve of his trial. All 6 were sentenced at Manchester Crown Court on the 3rd of February 2025. The connection between Donovan's operation and the Hoyton firm was documented in the EncroChat material that prosecutors assembled across both cases. Donovan had acted as a go-between in a dispute arising from the robbery of the Coggins brothers' stash house in Huyton, the same robbery that would ultimately unravel the Huyton firm's 30-year operation. Vincent Coggins had wrongly accused another Liverpool drug dealer of organising the theft. Donovan moved between the parties in that dispute, in the capacity of someone trusted enough by both sides to carry a message. His name appeared in the Hoyton firm's proceedings. His handle, Astral Cleaner, appeared in their messages. The criminal economy of Liverpool in the period between 2019 and 2020 was dense enough that the threads of different operations ran through each other, the same names appearing in different investigations, the same physical spaces used by different groups, the same money handlers processing cash from multiple sources. It was also during this period that Donovan became known in the EncroChat communications of other serious criminals on Merseyside by a specific nickname. He was referred to in those messages as Cop Killer. The name had not been given to him by law enforcement. It had been given to him by his criminal contemporaries, who used it without apparent irony or hesitation in encrypted messages they expected to remain private. The nickname documented something that the public record of his 2015 conviction had established, but that the criminal world around him had processed in its own way. He had killed a police officer. He had served his sentence. He had returned. The nickname was the criminal economy's notation of that sequence. Neil Doyle had worked for Merseyside Police for 10 years. He had colleagues who went on that Christmas night out with him and were still working for the force after what happened on Seal Street. His family had gone through the manslaughter trial and the sentencing, and the 3 years before Donovan was released on licence, and then the years between that release and the point at which the NCA investigation made visible what Donovan had been doing with his freedom. The 14.5 years handed down at Manchester Crown Court on the 3rd of February 2025 were not a continuation of the original sentence. They were a new sentence, for a new operation, built in the space that the first sentence had been designed to create. The NCA's head of financial investigation said that Donovan was a dangerous individual who had returned to criminality as soon as he left prison. The statement was accurate in its simplicity. He had left prison and returned immediately to the activity that the prison sentence was supposed to have addressed. The reinforced doors were the only concession he had made to the possibility that it might not go indefinitely well. His brother-in-law was extradited from Spain. His go-between relationship with the Hoyton firm was in the court record. His spreadsheets were in evidence. His questions about container ships were read into a court. The handle Astral Cleaner, chosen for anonymity on a platform that tens of thousands of serious criminals across Europe had trusted with their most candid thoughts, was now in every legal document connected to the prosecution. The platform had promised impenetrability. It had delivered something considerably less than that. Everything said in the belief that no one outside the conversation would ever read it had been read. By the time the sentences were handed down, the archive of Donovan's operation was more complete than most legitimate businesses could produce of their own activity across the same period. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.